Okay, well then today we're going to start talking about Augustine. We'll be discussing in general over the next couple of weeks the Platonic tradition as it develops throughout a rationalist tradition going through Augustine, Descartes, Leibniz, and a variety of other philosophers. These rationalists all take their starting point from Plato in a way, but also add their own twists and turns, especially Descartes, who really creates a new way of thinking about philosophy, and we'll get to him next time. But Augustine really prefigures already many of the key moves that are made by Descartes. As you can see, he lived in the 4th and 5th centuries. He was somebody who was born a Christian, ended up giving up Christianity in favor of being a Manichaean. That is to say, somebody who thought there were two great powers in charge of the world, one good and one evil, and they were fighting it out on the battleground of the world. He later converted back to Christianity, and in fact became Bishop of Hippo and became eventually one of the key figures in the development of the Christian church. One of his themes, right at the beginning of the work called the Confessions, is what I've put here, et inquietum est cor nostrum dona respiat te, which just means my heart is restless until it finds its rest in you. And in some ways, that's what the Confessions describe, his journey, his restless journey toward what he eventually believes is the truth. So, let's start with his theory of knowledge. He begins by trying to respond to the skeptic, and in fact he has a work against the skeptics called Contra Academicos, against the academic skeptics. Here is one of the arguments he gives. This is directed against the argument for illusion, which says, look, sometimes I fall prey to illusions, I think I see something, it turns out that's not what I'm seeing, so I'm mistaken, but then if that happens to me with some frequency, how do I know that right now I'm not suffering an illusion? Here's his response. In fact, I believe that the senses aren't untrustworthy, either because deranged persons suffer illusions, or because we see things wrongly when we're asleep. So here he also has in mind the argument for dreaming, for example. He says if the senses correctly intimate things to the vigilant and the sane, it's no affair of theirs what the mind of a sleeping or insane person may fancy for itself. So you might think about some skeptical scenarios. Here's one. You could think, yeah, what if this is an illusion right now? I think I'm up here in front of a room full of students teaching, but in fact it's some weird kind of illusion. There's some hologram. The university has decided I've gone crazy, okay? And they want to protect real students from me, but they don't want to fire me or something, and so they put me in a room with all these holographic images of students. So I think I'm continuing to teach when in fact nobody's here, right? That's possible. Now, okay, that would be an illusion then. You could all be illusory images created by the university to keep me mollified. Here's a second possibility. I'm hallucinating. Okay, I popped what I thought was a vitamin B12 pill this morning, so maybe it was something else. Okay, and in fact I'm flying by right now. I'm hallucinating this class, we're talking about cosmos on. In fact, I'm probably sitting in my backyard, staring at the sky. So that's a possibility. What about the possibility that I'm dreaming this? I in fact fell asleep in my office. And I'm dreaming that here, again, my mind is sort of feeling guilty and thinking, you should really be teaching class. But while I'm happily sleeping away, I begin to have this dream that I'm here teaching. Now, all of those are possibilities. But Augustine here is saying, well, give me a break. Okay, I don't think any of this has to do with my normal trust of my faculties. Yes, sometimes I suffer illusions. Maybe sometimes hallucinations are possible. Yes, I fall asleep and I dream. But still, do any of us take that as reason to reject the evidence of our senses? So, for example, you're sitting here in this room right now, listening to me talk, right? Is there anybody here who actually doubts that I'm speaking? Who says, you know, maybe it is all a hologram. Maybe Bob and I died years ago, and they're just running this holographic image, right? And collecting our tuition money without having to pay anybody. That's possible. Or maybe you're dreaming, or maybe you're hallucinating. Now, how much would you bet on any of this? That is to say, you know, is anybody here really thinking, you know, maybe that's true. Maybe I'm not really experiencing this. Augustine saying, no, of course not. Now, I think there's something actually deep behind this. A lot of people look at this and say, oh, wait a minute. This is really just dismissing it. This is a pretty anti-philosophical attitude. After all, what he's really saying is just, yeah, these philosophers have arguments about illusions, about dreaming, about hallucinations, and so on. But come on. Since I'm awake, and I'm sane, and I'm not hallucinating, none of this is really relevant to me. And that can look like it's missing the point. But I think here in the background is what's going on. And if we think about skeptical arguments this way, I think it will help us understand all of the skeptical arguments as well as a variety of responses to them. So here's one way of thinking about skepticism in general. Think about a mental state, like a belief or a perception. I might believe that I'm speaking to a group of students, or it might be my visual perception that's at stake, that I'm actually seeing a group of students in front of me. So we could be talking about a belief, maybe just a perception, and it might be visual, it might be something I hear, something I touch, etc. Now, these things represent something. It's most obvious in the case of vision, where it's clear that my visual representation is representing the way I think the world is around me. But I think my beliefs are also representing the way the world is. And if I'm hearing something, I would think that, well, something's causing that. I was in my backyard this morning and started hearing a dump truck on the next street, and it was loud, and I heard all sorts of things rumbling around, and I think that there is a truck on the next street. So in general, our mental states, like beliefs and perceptions and so forth, are intentional. And what philosophers mean by using that term is that they're about something. They are of something. They are about the way something sounds, for example, or about the way the world looks around me, or about the way the world really is. Or maybe it's a tactile impression, and it's really just my representation. In this case, the table is smooth. So in all of these cases, we're trying to describe something with our belief, or we take our perception as describing something about the way the world is. Well, they present the world, in other words, as being a certain way. We can call that mental state true if it's a belief, if it represents the world accurately. If it's a perception, we can't exactly call it true, but the philosopher's term of art for that is veridical. And that really just comes from the Latin word for true. So my perception is veridical if it's accurate, if it's actually portraying things the way they are. And if it's an illusion, like a Muller-Lyer illusion, for example, then I have to say, well, my perception is not veridical. It's actually illusory. It looks to me as if the one line segment is longer than the other, when it really isn't. And so in cases like that, we say, well, all right, there isn't a match between the content of my mental state and the way the world is. In other cases, there is. So say that if my mental state is true, like I've got a true belief, or a veridical, accurate perception, then we'll say that my perception or my belief, my mental state matches the world. Okay, we've got a match between my belief or my perception and the way the world is. So here are some examples. I think Concord is the capital of New Hampshire, and it is. So that's a match. I've got a certain belief. Concord is the capital of New Hampshire, and gosh, it's there. I mean, it's true. I've even been there. I've been in the state capital. And so that's a place where I can say, yes, there's a match. Reality does match my belief. I look out the window, let's say. Well, as I was writing this, I saw a rock squirrel out there. I don't know if you know what a rock squirrel is, but they're sort of darker in color than ordinary squirrels, and they are very skittish. They run around a lot. And for about 2 years, I had them living in my attic. But now they're just homeless rock squirrels running around the outside of the house. Well, anyway, if I look out and see a rock squirrel, and there is one there, then that's a match. If there isn't really one there, if I'm hallucinating this or confused, or it's an ordinary squirrel and I think it's a rock squirrel, then I've got a mismatch. Or here, I go to the eye doctor and I look at the astigmatism chart, this chart of lines that go out in all sorts of directions. There was one of those in my elementary school classroom. And I always looked at that and thought, I wonder what that represents. Nobody ever talked about it. They never gave us an eye exam when I was a kid. Well, finally, when I was in college and kept falling asleep when I tried to read philosophy, I of course blamed my eyes. Some of them had a different explanation. But anyway, I went to the eye doctor and he showed me a chart and he said, well, what does this look like to you? And I said, I remember that from my elementary school classroom. It's the same as it always has been. These really dark lines going like this, and really light lines going like that. And he said, yeah, no, that's not what it looks like. They're all the same shade. And I was astounded. But anyway, that's why I have these glasses. But that was a mismatch, okay? That was not a match. I thought some of those lines were much darker than other lines, and in fact they're not. So this was a case where I was suffering from a sort of illusion. I wasn't seeing things the way they were. So now, what does the skeptic do? The skeptic always introduces what we could call a skeptical scenario. That is to say, there's some situation in which I've got a mental state that is illusory or not true, But from within, I can't tell that it's not true. I can't tell that it's illusory. And so I look at the distance, for example, and I see something in the road that looks like a wet spot. And I think there's water on the road up ahead. Turns out it's a mirage, it's not really there. There is a mismatch there. There's something that is an illusion. And yet if I stop and say, well, let me look carefully, is that water or not? I can't tell from within that mental state. And the same thing is true if I'm suffering a hallucination. Do I know at the time that I'm hallucinating? Well, probably not. From within the dream, do I know that I'm dreaming? Probably not, maybe. But the whole idea of these skeptical scenarios is that there is a situation that's indiscernible from a match from within. I look at this and I think my mental state is fine. But in fact, there's an illusion going on. What I am thinking or what I am seeing is not the way things are. Okay, so the skeptic always introduces one of those. And the skeptical argument proceeds in something like this way. Okay? Among our possibilities, among our epistemic possibilities, given the way the world is, given what we know, it's possible that we're in one of these illusory states. It's possible that I am actually suffering an illusion right now, or that I'm hallucinating right now, or that I'm dreaming right now, or that an evil deceiver is out to get me right now. So one of those things might be the case. It's possible. But wait a minute, I could know that my own state of mind is veridical, that it matches the world, that my belief is true, for example, that my perception is accurate, only if I have a reason for discounting those skeptical scenarios. Even only if I, in other words, have some way of saying, well, yeah, maybe I could be hallucinating, there could be an evil deceiver, but, and then I have some way of pushing those aside and ignoring them. But now, do I have any grounds for discounting those skeptical scenarios? Do I have reason to think that I'm not asleep and dreaming? That I'm not hallucinating? That I'm not subject to an evil deceiver who's out to get me? Well, if not, the skeptic says, and the skeptic says, yeah, you have no grounds for that. That's the point of that undecidability premise in the argument from variability, for example. So therefore, we can't know that our states of mind are veridical. So, could I be hallucinating this whole experience right now? Well, it's possible. Do I have any grounds for saying, yeah, it's possible, but there are reasons to ignore it. I'm sure it's not the case. It's so remote a possibility, we don't have to really worry about it. Do I have any grounds for saying that? And the skeptic says, no, you don't. Now, I think what Augustine is doing here is actually really interesting. So I call it judo academy style. Academy after Plato's academy here. Not after a judo academy, actually. But what he does is flip this argument around. He keeps the first two premises the same. He says, in effect, I'll grant you that among our possibilities are these skeptical scenarios. Yeah, I could be suffering an illusion. I could be dreaming. I could be hallucinating. But, he says, and I'll agree with you, by the way, that I've got to have some way of discounting these skeptical scenarios. If I'm going to know anything, I can't really know that my state of mind matches the world unless I've got some way of pushing them aside. Because after all, it's possible that I'm suffering from an illusion or a hallucination or something. But now, he says, look, of course I can know that some of my states of mind are veridical. I've got very good reason for thinking that some of my states of mind are actually matching the world. And so we've got to have some grounds for discounting these skeptical scenarios. We must have some way of pushing this. I want you to imagine giving one of these skeptical arguments to somebody from your family who has never been to college. I like to imagine that I'm talking to my grandfather, who was a plumber back in the day, and was a very wise man, but would have had no patience for this. If Grandpa said, gosh, okay, I gotta go out, somebody's bathtub needs replacing. And I said, but Grandpa, it might be, that you're just dreaming this. You're hallucinating this. You have no reason to go out on that call. I mean, it might be, And of course, somebody could have been faking it. I don't think people sort of order plumbers the way they order pizzas. Sometimes it's a prank, but I suppose it's possible. If I had said, look, maybe you're asleep. Maybe you're hallucinating, blah, 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 he would have looked at me like I was insane and walked out the door and gone on his job. Now, Augustine is saying, and he's right to do it, okay? Surely we don't have to take these things seriously. And in fact, what happens? People sit in seminars where they talk about skeptical arguments, and do they really decide there's no point in doing anything? Did you all leave last week thinking, shoot, man, it's true, I know nothing. Nobody knows anything. What's the point of doing anything? Nobody knows anything. Here I was worried about, learning stuff in college, but nobody knows anything, so there's no way to learn anything. Nobody, in fact, probably left here thinking that. Why not? Augustine says, because we have a way of sorting out what are serious possibilities from what are merely, sort of merely philosophical possibilities, things that really we don't take seriously at all when we think about action. And so he says we have to have some grounds. Now, what they are is going to vary case to case, but he says, for example, think about right now whether you're awake or not. Or actually, since we've talked a little bit about that before, let's think about the other question. Could you be hallucinating right now? Do you have any reason to think this is not all a hallucination? Yeah?
There's no reason to think that this is a hallucination because it says continuity from what's been happening before. And if it continues that continuity, I'd have to say, I'm always hallucinating. This is what it says.
Oh, all right, good. So one thing you could say is, look, I have no reason to think that I'm hallucinating. I have no reason to believe it. Now, it could be, maybe somebody laced my coffee with LSD, conceivable. But you might say, look, I don't think so. I mean, I was there alone in the kitchen, unless one of the cats did it when I wasn't looking. I don't see how it's possible. And where are my cats getting LSD anyway? So you could say, I don't see how this is possible. I don't see why I should take this possibility seriously. And if that's right, you could say, this seems, I'll grant that it's possible, but it's so improbable that I really don't think I should have to worry about it. Any other reason? Now, actually, there's something else important in what you said, because if I should think that I'm hallucinating right now, then actually, since there's no special reason to think that would really be a reason to think that I'm just always hallucinating. That maybe there's just this radical mismatch between my mind and the world. And as we'll see, that's something that Descartes' evil deceiver argument leaves open. And Descartes, next time, is going to give us some reasons for trying to reassure us that kind of global skepticism, that look, everything all the time is completely mistaken, is not something we have to take seriously. I think it's a good point, though, to say Augustine so far hasn't given us that. Although you might think, look, something which just suggests that all of us are all the time confused isn't worth taking seriously. Here's another part of what he said, which is that, look, I'm getting by okay, right? The world seems to be pretty predictable. It seems fairly ordinary. Sometimes weird things happen and I begin to doubt it, but ordinarily I look around and think, the world behaves pretty predictably. I would think that if I'm dreaming or hallucinating, weird things would be going on. Suppose, you're worried about somebody having drugged you in some way, and then you see a large pink elephant flying by. That would make you think, maybe they did drug me, right? But if nothing like that happens, you're inclined to think, no, I don't think anything drugged me. I have no reason to think I'm under the influence of anything. And so, we look around for reasons like that to discount these skeptical scenarios. Well, Augustine gives us a variety of other arguments, and that one is one I'm going to develop more in a moment. But take a look at this argument. He says, the truths of logic and the truths of mathematics are things I can know even if the skeptical scenario is right. Suppose I am hallucinating. Still, 1 + 1 is 2. If I see one pink elephant and then another pink elephant, I've seen 2 pink elephants in my hallucination. That doesn't change. Or the truths of logic don't change. He says, I'm certain that either there's only one world or there are more worlds than one. I'm likewise certain that if there are more worlds than one, their number is either finite or infinite. And so maybe I don't know whether there are only finitely many possible worlds, whether there are infinitely many possible worlds, but it's got to be one or the other. I may not know whether there is life on other planets, but either there is or there isn't. It's not as if I really am in a position of complete ignorance about that. So at least I can know truths of logic, truths of mathematics, and that I'm hallucinating, dreaming, suffering an illusion shouldn't affect any of that. Here's another argument he gives about appearances. He says, look, and here, by the way, he's sort of getting into the skeptic, but also saying, I still have a kind of knowledge. Because he says, suppose I restrict my assent to the mere fact of something appearing a certain way to me. It appears to me right now that I'm speaking to a room full of students. Am I really? Well, maybe I am wrong about that. Maybe I'm hallucinating. Maybe I'm suffering from some kind of illusion. Maybe there's an evil demon. Maybe all sorts of, maybe I'm dreaming it, etc. But, he says, as long as I restrict myself to saying, well, it seems to me that I'm doing that, then all of that's irrelevant, right? Even if you're hallucinating, it still seems to you that you're doing the thing. And even if you're dreaming, it seems to you that you're doing that thing. So he says, in this case, there's no deception. I don't see how even an academic skeptic can refute a man who says, I know this appears white to me. I know that I'm delighted by what I'm hearing. I know that this smells pleasant to me. I know that this tastes sweet to me. I know that this feels cold to me. So we might think, maybe the thing isn't really cold. Maybe it's that I've come in from cold and maybe it's that I've been really hot and I feel something that's actually warm, but it feels cool to me. Well, I could be wrong about whether the thing really is cold, but I can't be wrong that it feels cold. And the same thing about this. I know that this tastes sweet to me. Maybe it's not really a sweet thing. Maybe something is messing with my taste buds. Nevertheless, that it tastes sweet to me now, that I have this sensation of sweetness, is something that I can know. But now, here is his most powerful one. And this is the one that Descartes picks up on later. I am most certain that I am, and that I know and delight in this. In respect of these truths, I'm not at all afraid of the arguments of the academicians who say, what if you're deceived? For if I'm deceived, I am. Certainly I'm not deceived in this knowledge that I am, and consequently neither am I deceived in knowing that I know. For as I know that I am, so I know this also that I know. So here he's saying, look, even if I'm hallucinating, I exist. Even if I'm dreaming, I exist. And so I can know that I exist. None of those things challenge my knowledge that I exist. Moreover, since I can conclude I exist, even if I'm dreaming, even if I'm hallucinating, even if somebody's deceiving me, even if I'm suffering an illusion, then I can know that I exist. Then I can know that I know that I exist. I can know that I know that I know that I exist. And so on. So I've actually got an infinite store of knowledge just on the basis of this. What do you know? I am. I know that I am. I know that I know that I am. How long do you want me to continue with this? Right? You can go on and on. And actually, he does more than that. Because notice he says, I know and delight in this. So I've not only got, I know that I am, but he says, and I delight in being. I'm glad that I am. And so I can know that I am. I can also know that I'm glad that I am. And I'm glad that I know that I'm glad that I am. And I'm glad that I know that I know that I'm glad that I am. And so on and so on. So I can start repeating these things as much as I want. Now, let's talk some about the metaphysics that underlies this. Because Augustine does something, well, I can't say he himself does something dramatically new. He takes some new ideas other people came up with in this Platonic tradition and puts them together in a novel way. So how does he do it? Well, let's go to something really simple, like the statement that that's a triangle. You have a belief, let's say, that that's a triangle. You perceive it as a triangle. So you've got a mental state here, and there really is a triangle there. We've got a match between your mental state and what there really is on the screen. When you look at it, your mind is turned toward that object, the image on the screen that you're perceiving. But it's also turned to the form of a triangle. Now, why do we say that? Because you recognize it as a triangle. And so you've got to know something about triangularity. You've got to recognize triangularity when you see it. So you perceive that thing as a triangle because you apprehend the form. Well, that suggests that we really need a picture like this. There in the middle is your thought. Whoops. I didn't know how to depict it, so it looks a little bit like a strip of bacon or something right there in the mind. The stop sign thing is supposed to be your mind. That little dark thing is your thought, that this is a triangle. And you're in part looking at the object of perception, that triangle on the screen, but in part also your mind is aware of triangularity. And you're recognizing it as a triangle because your mind has some connection to triangularity. Well, we've already talked about the way in which Plato develops the idea. Students of geometry, arithmetic, and so on aren't concerned with the actual object, the triangle they draw on the sand or on the blackboard or something like that. They're concerned with the ideas, the forms they resemble. And so we've got to think about those things. Not those physical objects, but the ideals they resemble, the things they're trying to behold with the eye of the mind. And so we might think, to look at that diagram, that the physical eye is pointing off to the right there toward the actual object. But then the eye of the mind is sort of going backward and looking at the form. And Plato thinks we have to have both of those. But now you can see there's a sort of problem. I can explain my perception of the object. Today we can explain it in a lot of neurophysiological detail. Back in the time of John Locke, there was just a vague idea. He described light as something like little tennis balls that bounced off objects and bounced into my eye. But he got the idea anyway. He called them little tennis balls, or corpuscles, or something like that, rather than photons. But nevertheless, he had something like the outline of it, correct? And so we can give a scientific theory to the right half of that diagram about how I perceive that object. But what about the left half? How can I be aware of triangularity? Where does that part come from? What do you mean the eye of the mind? How do I study the eye of the mind? What on earth is it doing? And so here's the problem that Platonism faces. We don't seem to perceive the forms. This talk of the eye of the mind seems awfully metaphorical. I don't really love that sort of thing as an explanation. And so how do we know anything about triangularity, or the good, or these various other things that Plato is concerned with? Well, Aristotle says because we look at individual cases. I see individual triangles, I see they have something in common, so I form the idea of triangularity. But Plato's response would be, that doesn't work, because in order to group them together, I've got to recognize them as similar, and to do that, I've got to recognize that they are all triangular. But in recognizing them as triangular, I am really already presupposing my knowledge of the form of triangularity. Now, you might be on Aristotle's side here, you might be on Plato's side, but that's the debate that starts forming. And Plato ends up saying, well, then how do I know about them if I think that's presupposed by even recognizing that those shapes are similar? He says, well, let me tell you one story. We recollect the forms. We were in contact with the forms before they were born. Before we were born. It's sort of it's a once upon a time story. Once upon a time, your soul was there in the land of forms. And it was bumping into those forms all the time. And the forms left impressions on your mind. And those impressions are still there. Then when you actually were born physically, you forgot. But we can remind you. We can actually remind you of triangularity, of the good, of justice, of courage, of all those other things. Now, there's something not entirely satisfying about that explanation. What's wrong with that explanation? Yeah.
Sort of saying that you forgot. That's sort of makes no sense, right? How did you forget? And if you forgot, then how do we know that's true?
Ah, good. All right, yes. If you forgot, then first of all, you're right. We owe you something more than a vague metaphor about your soul bumping into forms and then you forgetting, right? That seems a little fishy. But you're pointing to something really serious here, which is if you forgot, how do you know when you've got it again? Now, there is something that sometimes happens. If somebody asks you a question, who's the Prime Minister of England? And you think, ooh, I forget. And then it comes to you somehow. And you recognize it when it comes to you. It's not as if you end up just saying, oh, gee, I didn't know if it. It's like, ooh, I know if somebody told me, right? But I can't think of it. And so there is something like that. So maybe it's like that, when forgotten. But once you're reminded, oh yeah, I recognize that. And yet that's a little bit strange if you've forgotten how you know that that's the right one instead of some counterfeit. And that becomes a serious problem. But also, the idea here is, look, I can't explain now how you have contact with the forms, but I'll postulate a time when you did earlier and you're remembering that time. But if I don't understand how I interact with the forms, to say, I used to and I sort of forgot about it, doesn't seem to help. I want to know how it's possible for my mind to interact with the forms. I want an explanation for the left half of that diagram. And to say, well, I used to be in contact with them, doesn't really seem to answer the question. How did I get into contact with them then? He also says the form of the good is like the sun shining upon them, and that it makes all this knowledge possible. But if we don't understand how any form can interact with my mind, how can I understand how the form of the good interacts with my mind? So those aren't very satisfying explanations. Really, in the Republic, he leaves us with something like this. The form of the good there shines like the sun, and somehow makes it possible for us to interact with all those forms. But that's a bit of a metaphor, and it's very hard to understand how that would be possible. So, here is one way of thinking about the problem. The nominalist says, let's get rid of the forms. Okay, we've talked about the nominalist as somebody who says there are no universals, and so the nominalist is going to look at this and say, yes, you got into trouble the moment you put a form of triangularity, or the good, or justice, or courage, or anything like that out there. The moment you do that, you've created something we can't know anything about, and so that is a bad move. Get rid of the forms. Well, that seems like a beautiful solution. Just eliminate the whole left half of that diagram. The difficulty, in a way, doesn't skepticism now come back? After all, I've got my idea of courage, you've got your idea of courage, I have my idea of justice, you have your idea. Why should I think that any of us are right? Why not be skeptical and say there's no way to tell who's right? Because we have no access to anything that's independent of our minds. You use the term this way, I use the term that way. All we have to say is, well, either skeptic, nobody can know who's right, or maybe we're relativists. We say, well, that's justice for you, this is justice for me. No way to sort anything out beyond that. There's no such thing as justice as such. So nominalism makes a nice clean sweep of this, but there is a danger that we fall back into skepticism or back into relativism. And Plato introduced the whole theory to try to get away from those things. Here's a second option, conceptualism. That is to say, well, there are universals, so there's something like forms, but actually they're mind-dependent, they're ideas. And in fact, in the Greek, the term Plato often uses for the forms is ideo. It's their ideas. And so the conceptualist says, really, look, they're just inside the mind. There's something like what we would call concepts. But if universals are just concepts, then here's the solution, put the forms inside the head. If they're inside the head, then it's a question of just how we know about our own concepts. And that shouldn't be so puzzling. Of course I can know whether I have a concept of this or a concept of that. And so, well, by the way, that's not that easy a question. Somebody could say, what's your concept of energy? And you might think, that's actually a complicated question. And do you really have a solid concept of energy or not? You know, it might be a subtle matter. So I shouldn't say it's trivial by any means, but at least the thought is if we put the forms inside the head, they're in principle something I can know something about through introspection. But again, we've got this worry. Maybe skepticism comes back, because now I have my concept of justice. You have your concept of justice. I have my concept of triangularity. You have yours. And so either we become relativists and say, well, we're all right for us, or we become skeptics and say, I don't know how to tell who's right in any absolute sense. Well, the third option is realism, to say, Plato's right that these universals are real, that they really exist, they're independent of the mind, but how can we solve the problem? We have to have some way of knowing about it. And so we have to postulate something like an eye of the mind, some faculty that enables us to know these forms, these universals. But what could that be like? Well, Augustine does have a solution to that problem. It's a solution that a lot of you won't like, but maybe some of you will. Anyway, here is, I think, what is going on behind the scenes. He doesn't quite put it this way. How can I discount these skeptical scenarios? The possibility of dreaming, the possibility of hallucinating, or suffering from an illusion right now, or various other sorts of skeptical possibilities, by being a brain of that, or by being trapped inside the matrix, or something like that. Well, he says, we could have grounds for doing this, only if I can anchor my mental state to something that is, first of all, transcendent. And I'll talk more about what that is in a moment. But something that is really mind-independent. It's something outside me, and in a way fixed. And also epistemically accessible. That is to say, something I can know something about. So I've got to have something that anchors my use of the term justice, your use of the term justice, all of our uses of the term like good, a term like good, or triangular, or courageous, or whatever that is. And end up saying, yeah, if we're not to be trapped inside our own heads and either become relativists or think that there's just no solution to the skeptical problem, it must be possible to figure out that these things are anchored to something outside of us. What could that be like? Well, it would have to be independent of our individual finite minds. It couldn't be just that my mind is the anchor, right? I can't just say, what is triangularity? Well, that's the same as triangularity sub quadrat. It's what I say it is. Now maybe there are some things where I can do that. I can introduce a term and I can just say, by this I mean this, and that's what it means when I speak that way. But ordinarily, these things like justice and courage and so on, there's nobody in a position to say it's my usage. This is something that must exist outside of any of our individual minds. It also has to be stable across time and across possibilities. So for example, it shouldn't be that the word triangular changes its meaning on Tuesdays, or changes its meaning if a cat is in the room. These are things that shouldn't affect the meaning of triangular, or the truth of my claim that I am awake right now, and so on. These should be infinitary. Why? Well, there are infinitely many possible triangles that I want to be able to identify as a triangle. Infinitely many possible actions that I would want to identify as courageous actions. They should be normative. That is to say, they should establish rules for usage of the term that's correct or incorrect. If I take something that's three-sided and call it a triangle, I'm getting it right. I'm using the term correctly. If I take something that is a square and call it a triangle, I'm getting it wrong. And finally, it should be objective. It should be something that's outside of all of us and enable us to say objectively, that's really what the world is like. Well, what could be like this? Is there anything that could serve as this kind of transcendent anchor? Something outside of us that would be more stable than our own ideas, would be something that was infinite and actually established the way terms ought to be used in a way that our own individual concepts can't do. Well, here is one contribution of Philo of Alexandria. This is the Philo of On's drunkenness who introduced all those skeptical arguments. But like Descartes, he in the end is not a skeptic. He says, here's what I think is going on. The forms are independent of human minds, but they are nevertheless mental in some way. That's how we have contact with them. What are they? If they're not ideas in our minds, but they are ideas, then where could they be? They're in the mind of God. And so he says the forms are ideas in the mind of God. Now, notice what he's doing. He's combining realism and conceptualism here. He's saying they're independent of our own minds, but they're not mind independent in the broader sense. They're still mental things. And so when the conceptualist says, I can know about the forms, I can know about universals because they're concepts, Philo will say, right. But is it just my concept? Then I'm a relativist. Are we just saying, gosh, we all have different concepts, no way to tell who's right? Then we're skeptics. But if we can say, no, it's the concept that isn't in your mind or my mind, but in God's mind, aha, then we can say we can know about these things, but they're also independent of our individual minds. And so here, Philo comes up with, I think, the key move of what we can call classical rationalism. How can we know the world, the way the world really is, and not just the way it seems to us? Answer is because the structure of our mind matches the structure of the world. That is just a basic premise, I'm tempted to say, of rationalism. Not quite a premise, because in a way this whole argument is meant to give you some reason for believing it. But it's a major thesis of rationalism in its classical form. Here's how you can trust your perceptions of the world. Your mind is molded to the world. Or, let's say, they're both molded to the same mold. They match in their general structure. So here's Philo's idea of how that happens. The forms are ideas in the mind of God, and God stamps our minds with those ideas, also stamps the world with those ideas. And so, yay, the structure of my mind matches the structure of the world, because God says, let there be a world, let it have this general form, and let there be minds, and let them have the same general form. And so God is behind things engineering it, so that my concepts match the way the world actually is. So Philo calls this the Word of God, the Logos. And the Logos is stamped on my mind, the Logos is stamped on the world. Now you might like this theory or not like it, but anyway, that's the solution. So we take Plato's philosophy of mind, and we change the form of the good to God. And really, in a sense, Augustine does two things. He takes over Philo's idea that the forms are just ideas in the mind of God, and then says, how do we know about them? Because God actually illumines our mind. God can do anything, and so God actually sets things up so that our minds match the world. That, by the way, is how I can be sure that my thoughts actually do, in general, match the structure of the world. It's because God is stamping both with the same stamp. Well, that's a form of philosophical theory that actually lasts for about 1,000 years and has a certain kind of upheaval. But Descartes, as we'll see next time, shatters it and then tries to put it back together again. And we'll talk about whether or not it's a Humpty Dumpty situation, but he can actually put it back together.